Something also important to recognize is that even though a landowner may have multiple objectives, often those objectives are not mutually exclusive. For instance, you can harvest a sustainable amount of sawlogs while ensuring a clean source of water, while protecting water quality throughout that forest. Purposeful management may provide for the habitat required by a particular wildlife species of concern, while providing sawlogs as well, while maintaining water quality. Obviously, there's limits to this, and occasionally particular landowner objectives may clash. But again, that is the reason for management. That is the reason for purposefully coming up with a plan and implementing that plan. The concept of sustainable forestry is a broad one of many parts, given the vast array of ecological, economic, and social benefits that forest land provides. So in terms of sustainable forestry, we have to ask ourselves, how are we measuring sustainability? By what measures are we calculating this sustainability? Are we concerned with a sustainable supply of wood products, a sustainable source of clean air or clean water, a sustainable supply of wildlife habitat? The answer to the riddle of sustainable forestry is in the recognition that all of our purposeful management activities contribute to the patchwork of sustainable forestry on the landscape. Again, management occurs on a spectrum of intensity. It can range from highly intensive plantation management, with the sole purpose of growing a particular wood product, to the purposeful preservation of old-growth forest land by kind of wrapping it up and leaving it alone. In the middle are a whole host of management activities that are dedicated to both harvesting timber and maintaining the ecological integrity of the area under management. And so this involves choosing harvesting techniques that mimic, where possible, the natural disturbance regime of the area. This triad approach to sustainable forestry recognizes that all levels of management intensity contribute in a meaningful way, in a necessary way, to meeting the resource needs of our society, and doing so in a sustainable way. The task of forest managers is to decide, based on landowner objectives, where on the spectrum the management they propose should fall. And again, this just amounts to coming up with a plan. This slide provides a visual representation of the sustainable forestry triad. Again, all three management intensities are valid and appropriate based on the objectives of the landowner, and assuming the overall presence of any given management regime does not detract from our ability to meet the resource needs of society and protect the ecological integrity of the forest ecosystems in which management is carried out. A forest management plan is essential to meet landowner objectives in a sustainable way. The complexity of a management plan varies with several factors. The larger the property, typically the more complex the management plan. The more objectives a landowner has, the more juggling you have to do as a manager to meet those objectives. Landowner objectives are driven by the type of landowner. So a typical non-industrial private forest landowner, if there is such a thing as a typical non-industrial private forest landowner, would own a relatively small amount of forest land, but would have multiple objectives for the management of that forest land. Public agencies typically manage large areas of forest land, but also have multiple objectives for the management of that land. In contrast, often forest industry, industrial landowners, forest products industry, if they're in the business of producing a particular forest product, they also manage large areas of land, but for the most part they manage it for one or two primary objectives. The ecological setting in which management occurs also influences the complexity of management. The management of plantation forest land, or land dedicated to growing one primary species on a relatively short rotation in a very uniform way, is often pretty straightforward. Often managing natural forest land based on the natural disturbance regime of the area is a little more complicated. This concept of ecological forestry gets a little more complicated. regardless of the complexity of management, all plans should contain some basic information regarding the forest land at hand. There needs to be an acknowledgement and statement of the specific objectives of the landowner. After all, these are the things that are driving management strategies. There needs to be a systematic assessment of the forest resources on the property. This is referred to as a forest inventory. Forest inventory amounts to a statistically sound estimate of things like species composition, age structure, timber volume, timber value, habitat suitability, and so forth. The management plan, based on the landowner objectives and the ecological characteristics of the property, must provide a description of the applicable management strategies and a schedule of those treatments. The type of silviculture that is appropriate and when that silviculture should be implemented. Typical property level management plans provide a schedule of activities for the next 10 to 15 years. The next few slides provide an example of the management planning process for just a small 50-acre part of DuPont State Forest in western North Carolina. Alright, so here we are, DuPont State Forest, and this is an image of the stand prior to treatment. The stand that we're looking at was formerly pasture land. The DuPont Corporation, the owner of the property prior to the state of North Carolina, planted white pine seedlings throughout this pasture land. And out there on the state forest, there's hundreds of acres like this, areas that used to be farmland, used to be pasture land, that has since been planted with white pine. So this particular stand of trees was established 50 to 60 years ago, with the abandonment of farming, the abandonment of pasturing animals on it, and planting white pine trees. So it's an even age stand. It has been thinned twice. It was thinned, both times it was thinned, it was prior to the state ownership. And as of 2011, the stand that we're looking at, it had been established, the stand that was established on relatively poor soil initially is really at the end of its rotation. There's a significant amount of wind throw of the canopy trees throughout the stand, and given the loss of tree vigor, this solid block of white pine is at a pretty serious risk to southern pine beetle infestation. And as I just mentioned a little while ago, forest management planning, begins with a systematic inventory of the resources present in the context of the objectives of the landowner, and we'll get into those objectives shortly. And so this map here was developed for the purpose of conducting the initial inventory. Each number that you see on the map represents a plot where information regarding species composition, stand density, stand volume, and health was gathered. The inventory amounts to a statistically sound sample of trees throughout the stand, because for most forest management purposes, we can't go out and measure every tree on across 50 acres. So within each plot, for every tree included, the species, diameter, height, potential product, and health was documented. Tree by tree, it was documented for each one. The information gathered in the plots was utilized to make a statistically sound estimate of the entire area. So based on this inventory, the folks at DuPont State Forest now have an idea of how many trees per acre were present, how much basal area per acre was present, what the volume of those trees were, what the species composition of the stand was, and how valuable the stand was as both saw timber and pulpwood. The objectives for management in this stand included increasing species diversity overall, so that includes increasing the species diversity of canopy trees, increasing the species diversity throughout the understory. Another objective was to increase the amount of forest structure, both horizontal and vertical structure, as a means of improving wildlife habitat overall, or providing more diverse habitat for both game species and songbirds. Another objective was increasing the amount of hard mast, like acorns and hickory nuts, again, to benefit wildlife species who would utilize such material. And lastly, another important objective out there was to demonstrate a method of regenerating a declining white pine plantation in a way other than the traditional approach of clear cutting and planting it back. The goal here was to mimic natural disturbance to increase the ecological characteristics above. The intensity of management falls into this ecological forestry category if you're looking at it from this triad perspective. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here regarding the follow-up treatments that are anticipated or the really long-term schedule of treatments in this stand. The purpose of this is really just to look at this initial entry in terms of how management was planned and how it was carried out. So here's the nuts and bolts of the first harvest entry prescription. As a means of meeting the objectives just stated, large groups were marked to be harvested, groups of a third to a half acre in size. And this size really falls into the group selection category of regeneration. It's a relatively small gaps are created. But this harvest, it wasn't initiated with the intention of maintaining an uneven age stand in perpetuity. So it really should be looked at as an even age treatment, which will eventually harvest the entire stand over the course of several entries, this just being the first entry. The goal here was, by harvesting in these gaps, to endorse the establishment and release of oak and hickory species, along with the anticipated white pine regeneration, really in the partial shade along the periphery of the gaps, along the outside of the openings. The prescription also called for the retention of standing dead trees and coarse woody debris, big down woody debris on the forest floor. Both of those have implications for long-term site productivity and wildlife habitat. When harvested, the trees were to be cut to length in the woods, and so what that meant is all unmerchantable material was cut and left in the woods, left on the forest floor. And again, this was to really minimize the threat of erosion and nutrient loss. And so this map here is what amounts to the operations map. This is obviously a planning document, but this is actually what was given to the logger as well prior to the operation, to be perfectly clear about how things were to be cut and what the intent of the harvest was to be. The blue circles on the map indicate the groups that are marked for harvest. The orange lines represent skid trails, by which the trees would be transported from the forest to the deck. The orange D on the map represents the deck. The deck is where the logs are processed and loaded onto a truck to be transported to the mill. The blue lines on the map represent perennial streams within the management unit, a really important ecological characteristic that needs to be documented and accounted for during management planning. If you're looking close enough, you may also notice in the top portion of the unit there's a shelter wood harvest marked as well. And so that was just another part of this harvest, but we're not going to get too far into that. And so this is what one of the groups looks like post-harvest. Again, this type of harvest was designed to mimic the effects of a natural disturbance. In this case, the disturbance being a large-scale windstorm, something that's a common event in the southern Appalachians. But it was also designed to be economically feasible as well. In this instance, the harvest had what I believe is a positive ecological impact, but also the state forest benefited from the proceeds of the timber sale. This is an example of tops and limbs that were purposefully left in the woods to minimize soil erosion and nutrient loss. In the foreground here is an example of the type of regeneration protected and released during harvesting. So this black oak seedling will eventually contribute to a stand with more biodiversity and structure than the previous white pine plantation. post-harvest monitoring is an essential part to successful management as well. In the case of this operation, post-harvest work and monitoring focused on stabilizing the roads and skid trails used to transport the logs from the woods to the deck and from the deck to the state-maintained roads. The presence of invasive species was monitored. Where invasive species were found, like Oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, they were removed if they'd become established following the harvest. The establishment of adequate regeneration was also monitored to determine if supplemental planting was necessary. In this instance, the regeneration is proving to be adequate. Given so that no planting is necessary. Given the heavy recreational presence on the forest, it was also important to keep folks out of the area as roads and skid trails were stabilized following the harvest.